A freezing wind wrapped in ice and snow swept across the coastline of the North American continent. Flocks of ravens circled above the battlefield. The white snow was splattered with dark red blood. A group of Viking warriors, clad in heavy armor and wearing horned helmets, landed and launched a surprise attack. After the massacre, a boy was left behind in the ruins, with pale skin and cold eyes. He stood trembling before a group of indigenous people armed with bone spears. In his eyes there was fear, but also a trace of untamed wildness. To kill him meant eliminating a potential route of destruction. To spare him meant leaving a hidden danger that might turn on his benefactors. In the choice between survival and faith, a seed of hatred and a thought of mercy took root simultaneously on this barren land. The blood-soaked earth ultimately gave birth to a heavy epic. This is the story told by the 2007 epic action film Pathfinder. The time is pushed back to 600 years before Columbus arrived in the Americas. On this continent where the people of the Dawn have lived for generations, a group of Vikings known as the Dragon Men intruded as marauders. The ocean breeze swept across the coastline. These Vikings originally attempted to establish a settlement here, but the fierce resistance of the people of the Dawn made them pay a heavy price, ultimately halting their advance. The Vikings were forced to retreat, and in their haste, they left a young boy behind on the battlefield. When the warriors of the people of the Dawn discovered him among the piles of corpses, the atmosphere suddenly grew tense. An ancient prophecy circulated within the tribe.
There is a prophecy that tells of a creature swift of foot, white as snow. When he is seen, change follows, like a storm.
In this boy, the Indians saw a pale complexion they had never seen before, alongside a pair of eyes radiating a chilling cold. Some, in terror, called him an evil spirit. The angry tribespeople believed that the same blood as the invaders flowed through his veins, and that sooner or later, he would become a disaster. They demanded his execution. Just as he was about to be executed, an Indian woman stepped forward. There was no hatred in her eyes, only compassion for life itself. Facing her angry tribespeople, she asked one question.
If we put this child in the cold to die, who will be the monsters then?
These words gradually cooled the anger of the tribe. Everyone felt her words made sense. Ultimately, the tribal chief decided to keep the child. Because of his distinctively pale appearance and his unknown origins, the tribe gave him a name, Ghost. A story transcending bloodlines and hatred thus began upon this vast land. 15 years passed. The Viking toddler of the past, raised by the Indian tribe, grew into an agile and physically strong young man. Ghost had completely integrated into the life of the people of the Dawn. He wore animal skins, used a bow and arrows, and harbored deep affection for the land that raised him and his tribal kin. When spring arrived, the tribe held a grand spring market. Tribespeople from various branches trekked long distances to trade and interact. Ghost's tribe also came. At this bustling market, the spiritual figure of the people of the Dawn, the Pathfinder, also appeared. The Pathfinder was not only the leader of the tribe, but also the embodiment of wisdom and tradition. His daughter had also blossomed into a beautiful young woman, but an undercurrent lurked beneath the peaceful surface.
There was an avalanche during the winter hunt.
How many dead?
3 of the 4 hunting parties. Among them, he who was to take my place.
Have you chosen another?
It will be one of them. But which one? I do not know yet.
This blow cast a shadow over the tribe's future. The aging Pathfinder had to choose an heir from among the remaining young warriors as soon as possible, as required by ancient tradition. For Ghost, these 15 years were also a silent inner struggle. Although he deeply loved his Indian parents and longed to become a respected warrior in the tribe, his Viking heritage always lingered like a shadow. His unusual appearance constantly reminded him that the blood of invaders flowed within him. The tribal elders also saw his confusion. The Pathfinder warned him that the prophecy about the white demon still remained in the hearts of the people. Ghost had to put in much more effort than an ordinary person to prove he was worthy of staying there. There is a detail worth noting here. When the film shows Ghost's daily life, his face is often hidden in shadows, contrasting with the vibrant, sunlit totems of the Indians. This is a deliberate choice, representing his cognitive struggle with his own identity. He was born a dragon man, yet raised as a member of the people of the Dawn. This sense of being torn apart foreshadows that the subsequent conflict will force him to shatter his outward calm and confront his inner struggle head-on.
If I cannot be a brave, then who am I?
Ghost repeatedly asked himself in agony. His Indian adoptive father, although aware of the secret of his bloodline, still firmly viewed him as a son, reminding him not to wander too far when he went out. This familial love became the softest yet strongest bond in Ghost's heart. But the gears of fate took a cruel turn at this very moment. Just as Ghost briefly left the village, a disaster quietly descended. Those dragon men who had once been repelled set foot on this land once again after many years. This time, they brought even more absolute destruction. Thick smoke billowed into the sky. The Vikings brandished giant steel swords, slaughtering unarmed civilians. The Viking leader coldly announced that he would grant these savages a bit of dignity, a clean, swift death by the sword. When Ghost sensed something was wrong and ran desperately back to the village, the sight before him shredded his familiar world. His once peaceful home had turned into a sea of fire. Ghost frantically searched for his family in the ruins. Agonized screams filled his ears. He witnessed his Indian mother lying lifeless in a pool of blood. Not far away, his Indian adoptive father was being attacked by Viking warriors. His adoptive father's primitive weapons were no match for the Vikings' heavy armor and iron swords. As the Viking's blade was about to fall, Ghost roared and charged forward to save his father, but it was too late. He watched helplessly as his adoptive father took his last breath right in front of him. Immense grief and fury instantly swallowed him. The Vikings noticed this young man, whose appearance was visibly different from the Indians, looking more like one of their own kind. They mocked him, clamoring to take his sword away before he hurt himself and demanding his head. Ghost answered with action. He snatched a Viking sword and let out a roar. He was no longer the docile Indian foster son. He transformed into something else entirely. In this clash of drastically unequal strength, Ghost relied on his familiarity with the terrain and his heart full of rage to temporarily escape their pursuit. The Viking leader looked at the chaotic scene and ordered that the land be wiped clean before they settled down completely. They captured an Indian prisoner who knew the way, intending to force him to lead their army to the next village. The surviving Ghost traveled alone through the forest. He knew the Viking slaughter would not stop. They lived for plundering and killing. Enduring the pain of losing his parents, he dragged his exhausted body and finally found the Pathfinder and his tribe on the move before the Vikings could reach them. When Ghost appeared with his desperate warning, panic immediately spread. He described the terrors of the Vikings to the Pathfinder and the tribe.
They will kill you all, down to the last man, woman, and child. They may let one of you escape, so they can follow you to the next village. But they will cut out your tongue first so you can warn no one. I've seen them do it.
What about your village?
They're dead.
They will follow your trail here.
I told you to leave me. You should have listened.
Then we will stand and fight.
They all carry these weapons, and they're covered in a skin that arrows of stone cannot pierce. Run and you may live.
Facing an unprecedented crisis of life and death, the Pathfinder displayed the decisiveness of a leader. He swiftly ordered the tribe to relocate. One group would evacuate toward the bay, heading west through the high mountains. Meanwhile, he instructed them that upon reaching the fork marker, they should take the small trail east, because spring had arrived early. The western route was at risk of avalanches and was unsafe. After arranging the escape route, the most heart-wrenching scene arrived. The Pathfinder asked Ghost what he planned to do. Cold, murderous intent flashed in Ghost's eyes. He replied calmly and resolutely, "Kill as many of them as I can." The Pathfinder looked at the young man consumed by hatred, knowing he could not be dissuaded. He did not stop him, but his daughter, her face full of worry, said, "You can't just let him go like this." The Pathfinder said to his daughter, "He must find his own path. His heart is full of revenge." Subsequently, the main force began an emergency evacuation. As the tribe's people fled in panic, Ghost and a fellow tribesman turned and walked deep into the canyon. All paths converged here. They would wait here for the Viking army, using the terrain and traps to confront those opponents who were like steel monsters. Just as they were setting traps and preparing for a desperate fight, the Pathfinder's daughter disobeyed her father's orders and quietly slipped away from the group to find him. Here, the film sets up a crucial piece of dialogue. Deep in the canyon, the Pathfinder's daughter stood before Ghost. She directly posed a piercing question.
There are two wolves fighting in every man's heart. One is love. The other is hate.
Which one wins?
The one you feed the most.
This line is the core of the entire film. This was not just a physical battle, but a tug-of-war within Ghost's humanity. Would he sink into the bloodthirsty hatred of the Vikings, or would he hold on to the love and protection taught to him by the Indian tribe? Deep in the canyon, the torches were extinguished. Branches and spears were readied. As the Vikings' footsteps gradually drew near and the war cries of the dragon men echoed in the valley, a desperately mismatched bloody battle officially began. In the canyon, the slaughter suddenly erupted after a period of dead silence. Like a cheetah hiding in the shadows, Ghost utilized the narrow terrain and meticulously placed traps to launch a desperate, suicidal assault against the heavily armed dragon men. He darted nimbly between the trees and rocks. Every strike was accompanied by the heavy thud of an enemy falling to the ground. However, individual bravery is ultimately limited in the face of sheer numbers and steel armor. The Vikings' heavy armor deflected the crude bone spears, and they pressed forward relentlessly like tireless war machines. Just as Ghost was locked in a bitter struggle and was about to be swallowed by this black torrent, the Pathfinder threw himself back into the battlefield with no regard for his own life. But his return failed to turn the tide. Instead, he became the Vikings' most deadly bargaining chip. The brutal Viking leader, Gunnar, saw through Ghost's weakness. Like a pack of wolves, they drove them into a corner, ultimately capturing Ghost alive. In the bitter, chilling wind, the torture began. The Vikings pinned Ghost firmly against the rough rocks, trying to use physical agony to destroy his will and force him to reveal the direction in which the people of the Dawn had fled. Whipping, beating, and maniacal laughter all mixed together. Leader Gunnar arrogantly looked down at this anomaly with a Viking's face, but the bones of a savage, saying he would tear him to pieces. Facing this inhuman torture, Ghost clenched his jaw tightly. Blood slid down his pale cheeks. A glimmer of resolve and astuteness flashed through Ghost's cold eyes. He knew that revenge could not rely solely on blind rage. It also required the sharp judgment of fighting for survival from a place of certain death. He deliberately put on a show of weakness, as if his defenses had crumbled, and proposed a trade to the Viking leader. He would personally lead the way and guide the Dragon Men to the hidden settlement of the People of the Dawn, on the condition that they spare the Pathfinder's daughter. The arrogant Viking leader contemptuously agreed. In their eyes, this broken traitor posed no further threat. Thus began a death march, seemingly a guided trek, but in reality, a walk into doom. Ghost led the massive Viking contingent, not toward the safe valley, but rather turning back west, heading straight for the extremely dangerous snowy mountains and frozen lake. He knew well that these dragon men came from a bitterly cold land and believed they understood ice and snow better than anyone else. But they made a fatal mistake. They did not understand the fury and peril of the melting ice and snow during the North American spring. To prevent Ghost from escaping, the Vikings were extremely cautious, tying everyone end to end with a thick rope, chaining Ghost and the Pathfinder's daughter to this deadly lifeline as well. But at this moment, this rope, representing collective strength, turned into the Grim Reaper's noose. If even one person plummeted into the abyss, everyone would be dragged into oblivion together by the immense weight. This was Ghost's final gamble, using their own strength against them. The procession trudged arduously across the fragile ice and along the edge of the precarious snowy mountain. The Vikings began to feel uneasy. They cursed Ghost for leading them blindly, yet their haughty pride would not allow them to show fear in front of these savages. When the group reached the most perilous part of the cliff, Ghost knew it was time to make his move. He suddenly lowered his voice and sternly commanded the Pathfinder's daughter behind him.
I want you to hit me.
Facing his bewildered lover, he repeated this sentence almost maniacally. He needed to create chaos, a chaos profound enough to make the Vikings lose their balance and cause nature to completely unleash its fury. The Pathfinder's daughter, torn between despair and trust, finally held back her tears, raised her fist, and struck Ghost fiercely. This sudden infighting instantly ignited the Vikings' fury. They roared about teaching these two a lesson, their heavy footsteps violently stomping and grinding against the thin layer of ice. In that split second, Ghost suddenly sprang into action. The heavy armor the Vikings were so proud of became deadly lead weights at this moment. The rope that bound them together turned into chains, dragging everyone under. Screams and the clashing of metal were swiftly swallowed by the freezing lake water and the cascading avalanche. One by one, the Viking warriors were forcefully dragged into the abyss by the weight of their comrades. Gunnar bellowed that Ghost had chosen the savages over his own people, cursing him as nothing more than a crying child who couldn't even remember who he was. Facing this leader of his own kind, who had slaughtered countless people and represented his own dark bloodline, Ghost straightened his back, letting the cold wind blow through his long hair. With all his might, he let out a furious roar to the vast land and the destiny that had haunted him for half his life. Amidst this earth-shattering judgment of nature, Ghost survived, relying on his incredible willpower and his prior preparation of cutting the rope. Covered in freezing water and blood, he stood at the edge of the broken cliff, like a man returned from hell. That once invincible Viking leader, Gunnar, was also driven into a dead end. This was not a simple declaration, but a total awakening of the soul after experiencing blood and fire. He personally ended the Viking leader's life with a sharp blade. With his dying breath, the leader gasped that he was the last dragon man on this cursed land. Ghost coldly replied,
You're not my kind.
In this moment, he completely severed the final tie to his invader bloodline. The smoke cleared, and the snowstorm ceased. That ancient prophecy reached its conclusion in a completely inverted manner. The animal as white as snow came accompanied by a storm, but he did not destroy the people of the dawn. Instead, he transformed into a tempest that purged the foreign evils from this land. Just like that fallen elderly Indian father, Ghost took up the heavy responsibility of protection. He stood on the turbulent coastline, his gaze looking toward the edge of the horizon. He became the new Pathfinder of the people of the dawn. Day after day, he guarded this coast, searching for any traces the dragon men might have left behind, turning the hatred in his chest into a bulwark against foreign enemies. Caught between the blood feud of two peoples, he appeared to belong to neither side. But with his own flesh and blood, he simultaneously embodied the formidable strength of the Vikings and the compassion of the Indians. He altered his own destiny, and also altered the destiny of all the tribespeople on this continent. In that era, where the wild and the savage intertwined, what truly determines who we are is never the blood flowing in our veins, but which wolf in our hearts we choose to feed at the crossroads of love and hate. After reading this story full of primal wildness and bloody struggle, what are your thoughts?